Thermostat, I never turned it back on. Today, we're gonna teach you about 10 tools that you didn't know you needed when working with wood and epoxy. Now, we use these tools every day. We've got 9 of them on the table here, and then there's one that we couldn't fit on the table.
Like the Titanic in a pond.
That you'll see near the end. Starting with reusable molds. A lot of people decide to build their own molds, which can be a challenge because they take time and materials to build, which is costly. And if they don't do a perfect job, it ends up leaking, which costs money and time. Think of building a mold like having to build a fish tank. You know, you can't have your fish tank leaking, you can't have your mold leaking either. So we use a lot of these Empire molds, reusable molds. There's 3 round sizes and a bunch of rectangle sizes, but they don't leak, they're reusable. You know, we've used these things, I don't know, 20 plus times, and we just keep using them, they don't wear out, and they're easy to demold. We actually have one already set up. We poured this like last week at some point. So I'm just gonna show you quickly how to demold it, and then we'll move on to the next thing. So it's that easy. Next up, we've got hot glue gun. Now, you're probably thinking this is for arts and crafts, but we use it every day when we're filling knots in the top of a table. What we'll do is draw a line or a perimeter of hot glue around the pour, so when we top up that pour, the pour doesn't end up all over the slabs. Some people use silicone, which you can use to do these top sort of perimeters, but sometimes the silicone, depending on the type, will stain the wood. So the hot glue, it peels off easy, but it creates a watertight barrier. All right, next up, we're gonna talk about a paddle mixer. So most people go ahead and mix their epoxy with a wooden stick or like a paint mixer, and that's okay, but it can be a challenge to mix the epoxy thoroughly. Epoxy is a 2-part mix, so you wanna make sure those 2 parts are fully mixed, where using a paddle mixer, you can work your way around the bucket or mixing container and really make sure that the epoxy and the pigment is all mixed up. One of the biggest questions we get is how to clean this, and you can see here, we don't clean it. We let the epoxy cure on it. Sometimes we'll tap it with a wire brush or something to take off any loose bits, but we just go right back to mixing when it's cured. Next up, we've got our tools for cleaning up the live edge for the epoxy pour. Now, first, we normally start with a draw knife, and this is used to remove all the large pieces of bark off the edge. It's important to remove the bark because the bond between the bark and the actual wood is your weakest point. So if your epoxy is only holding on to the bark, you have a weak point between bark and wood, where when you remove that bark, the epoxy can penetrate the live edge of the wood without the bark and have a proper bond, and it eliminates the chance of it breaking apart later. Now, after we debark with the draw knife, we normally grab a wire brush and just brush the edge of that wood to remove any loose bits or smaller, finer pieces of bark that were left behind. Not totally necessary, but for the cost of what this is, it could save you a lot of headaches down the road. Lastly, we use what kind of looks like a dental pick, and we use this for knots and bark inclusions that are in the top of the slab. So if you've got a little bark inclusion or a knot that you want to pick out, this is ideal for it. Sometimes we'll even use it on the edges to pick away at sort of areas that are a little more tricky to get with the draw knife. So we've got tuck tape. We use this mainly for sort of patching the underside of a slab. If you have a knot that goes all the way through or a check in the end of a slab, we'll run tape along it and put some on the end. That way we can pour after the epoxy cures, peel the tape off and start sanding. Another use for this would be to build your own form if you don't have a reusable form, or you need to build a form that's larger than what the reusable ones come in. So we'll take some plywood and clad the plywood with the tape and clad the walls of our form with the tape, because the cured epoxy won't stick to the tape. So yeah, it's any spot that you need epoxy not to stick to, you can add this to it. Oh, one more thing. You can apply this, let's say we have to do a little fill on the corner of a slab. You can apply this around the edges so that you can fill that up and the epoxy doesn't just roll off the edge. That's another use for this stuff. Next up, we're gonna go with the digital scale. We find it most accurate to mix epoxies by weight. You can use those containers with the lines on them to get the 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 mixture, depending on your epoxy. But we find the scale works best. We run all our math and figure out how much resin and how much hardener and what the weight is. And then we just fill up to match up with what we calculated. So just an accurate way of getting a good mix. Ironically, if you mix too much hardener into your mix, it will never harden. We made that mistake the very first time we did an epoxy pour because we heard someone else did a pour and it didn't cure hard enough. So I thought, let's add more hardener, and it actually makes it not cure. So if you want it to cure harder, use a bit less, but best of all, just mix it accurately, use a scale. Next up, we're gonna go with torch. So we use a torch or a heat gun. You could also use a blow dryer if you don't have those items. And we use this to remove bubbles from the top of a pour. Now, it's not always super critical to do this, but we find it's nice to run that along the top of the surface, get rid of the bubbles. You can see what's going on with the pour, especially if it's clear and you wanna make sure that there's no debris floating in it. But we find this step of removing bubbles with the heat gun most important when we have a shallow engraving. So if we do a lake board and we pour the epoxy and there's some bubbles on top, sometimes those bubbles go actually low enough that when we sand off the epoxy, you're left with a little crater. And then it's a challenge to fill those nicely. So best off to remove all the bubbles on a shallow pour, such as an engraving. Let's talk about pen and paper and calculator. This may seem silly, but every time we start a pour, we'll calculate how much epoxy we need. We'll jot it down, we'll double check it, make sure we don't mix up twice as much as we need or half as much. It's a good thing. It's like measuring twice and cutting once. You measure your epoxy amount twice and pour once. So we'll jot down all those notes. Then when we add pigment, we'll use measuring spoons and we'll document how much pigment went into how many liters. This may sound insignificant, but if we do a pour like this today, and then in 3 months, a customer sees us say, hey, can you make me a dining table like that? I want the exact same color. It's gonna be tough for us to remember back, 50 pours ago, how much pigment, how much volume of epoxy was there. Where if we jot everything down, we can reference those notes and say, yeah, we can match this exact color, no problem, without any issues or challenges. So we'll normally jot it down to start, and then we take it to the computer and put it into a Google Doc. So we have every pour with how much pigment documented, and it's safe versus a piece of paper floating around the shop. And then calculator, we just use this to double check our calculations for how much epoxy to use and how much pigment to add to the epoxy, and make sure we get the resin to hardener ratio correct when we're calculating weight. So it's always handy to have one around. I mean, most people have a phone in their pocket, but we just keep an actual physical calculator out.
For nostalgia.
It looks nostalgic. Next up, you're gonna want some HDPE in your shop. So we normally buy 4 foot by 8 foot or even 5 foot by 10 foot sheets of this. You don't have to go that extreme. We just do a lot of big tables, so it's handy to have the bigger sheets. But if you have a smaller amount, you can rip the strips to create dividers for the forms, or you can use smaller blocks and use them as clamping blocks in your form. You can actually see where we have these here. This will prevent your clamps from getting epoxy down to your wood because the cured epoxy won't stick to the HDPE. So yeah, instead of having your clamps stuck to your form or stuck to the top of your wood, it's best off just to use these. They're cheap, they're reusable. We use them all the time. And it'll save you a bunch of money. But yeah, definitely having the sheet of HDPE, whether you're ripping strips for dividers or walls for a form or clamping blocks. One other use, if you do kind of epoxy art, it would be nice to have a whole work table that's covered in HDPE. That way, when you get drips and spills and little drops of epoxy, after it cures, you can literally peel it off with your fingernail and you're not stuck with a wood surface that it's near impossible to remove. Okay, so our last and final item that didn't fit on this table and has saved us thousands of dollars, and I'll explain why, is a fan. Now, we use these every day in our shop. It helps dissipate the heat from an exothermic reaction. So when you mix the resin and the hardener together, it creates an exothermic reaction and heat is the result of it. So if it gets too hot, you'll get a lot of bubbles curing in it, or it'll cure and be very fragile. It may even crack sometimes because it shrinks when it heats. So what we do is we just run a fan over top of our workpiece, not directly into it, to help dissipate some of that heat. So, you know, you don't want this thing just getting hotter and hotter and hotter. If you can have that breeze going over top of it to help move some of the heat. Now, it's especially important in, you know, the southern states where it's a bit hotter. You know, up here in the summertime, we definitely use them. The winter, not as critical because our shop temp is a bit lower. But yeah, they definitely come in handy, and size doesn't really matter. We've got, you know, huge industrial ones, but you can also use smaller fans like this, or even tabletop fans. They don't have to be, you know, expensive industrial ones. You can use any old fan that you have around the house just to help dissipate the heat. So anyways, thanks for watching. If you got any value from this video, make sure you hit like and subscribe. Leave us a comment. I'm sure we'll get tons of questions about this. Or if you've got anything that we missed, leave it in the comments. We'll be checking it out. We'll be responding. Yeah, let us know what we missed and if you have any questions.